Welcome to the Life and Legacy of George Griffin, a Mark Twain House Trouble Begins special event. I'm Steve Courtney, a curatorial researcher, editor, and writer here at the Mark Twain House. This event is a bit longer and different from our normal Trouble Begins lectures, which take their name from Mark Twain's own lecture posters that read, "The Trouble Begins at 8. We indeed have a surprise for you all this evening, a reveal not like Al Capone's safe, better. The reveal will come from our speaker, the Twain collector and scholar from Austin, Texas, Kevin MacDonnell. Kevin is an unusual collector, combining his passion for collecting Mark Twain books, letters, manuscripts, and even tchotchkes with a serious interest in Mark Twain scholarship. Now he has set his extraordinary skill at detective work to research probably every known aspect of Mark Twain's butler and friend, George Griffin. Yes, this relates to the reveal I mentioned. Enough said. After Kevin's talk, a panel of experts will provide their own take from differing perspectives about both Griffin and what you will just have heard. Thank you for joining us today, both here in the Mark Twain House's auditorium and from your own homes. If you want another look at what's happening tonight or know someone who couldn't be here personally or virtually, a video will be made available on the Trouble Begins playlist of our YouTube channel, accessible through our website, marktwainhouse.org. And big thanks to our sponsors for the 2024 Trouble Begins season, Kathleen and David Jimenez, and of course, our pasta reception sponsor, the wonderful downtown restaurant, Salute. Kevin MacDonnell is a leading Mark Twain scholar and collector of books and memorabilia. He co-edited with Alan Gribben Mark Twain's Rubaiyat, contributed articles to the Mark Twain Encyclopedia, co-edited with R. Kent Rasmussen an anthology of essays, Mark Twain and Youth, and has reviewed over 50 books for the online Mark Twain Forum. His information as imparted in that forum can always be relied upon, and Mark Twain is someone who generates mythology like a rabbit makes bunnies. He has been a longtime friend of the Mark Twain House, generously lending items for exhibitions and helping out in countless other ways. His recent research into the life of George Griffin is published in the Mark Twain Journal, which will be available in the gift shop after the program, and Kevin has agreed to sign copies. It's quite a work and worth getting, I think. Welcome, Kevin.
You're not here to see me, but are you here to see George Griffin? Yes. All right, you come to the right place, but there's much more to George Griffin than meets the eye. I also have to mention it's going to be a bumpy ride. There will be strong language. I'm going to be substituting the word Negro for the other word when I'm quoting particular people who are in the habit of using the other word. So viewer discretion is advised, but there's no other way to tell that story than to use the language that was used by the people of that time. Until now, accounts of George Griffin's life have been brief and incomplete. Sometimes they've been mere footnotes, mentioning but never exploring his life before or after his life with the Clemenses. He's sometimes portrayed as a cartoonish, one-dimensional, lovable rascal, there's a word I hate, existing only in the background of Mark Twain's biography. George Griffin was born in 1849 in Maryland. His mother's name was Dinah. He was enslaved even in her womb, and for all practical purposes, he was an enslaved piece of property before he drew his first breath. His future looked bleak, but George's future would be bright. He would serve as a body servant to a Union general in the Civil War. He would be for 2 decades Mark Twain's personal butler. He would mingle with New York high society at the end of his life. Along the way, he would inspire the fictional incarnation of the character Jim in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the most important black character in American literature. He would also experience heartbreak His life, which began in the tragedy of slavery, would end in tragedy as well. Who was George's father? We have some clues. George called himself a mulatto. William Dean Howells called him a yellow butler. These are 19th century slang for a person of mixed race, and of course, neither of those are acceptable terms today. There were 10 Griffin households in Maryland that held enslaved people, but only one that included a 1-year-old boy in its slave schedule in the 1850 census, and that was on the plantation of a man named Walter Parker Griffin. Walter Griffin owned 14 enslaved people, ages 1 to 50. Whether he was George's father, we have no way of knowing or proving, but white paternity of enslaved babies was commonplace. And regardless of the mother's surname, the fathers often gave their name to their offspring. On the other hand, many former enslaved people simply chose their own surnames after they were emancipated. As a slave, George's childhood had no stability, and he had no agency. His mother and other family members could be sold at any moment and separated from him forever. But he learned to read and write at some point. Maryland was the only slave state that had no laws impeding the education of enslaved people. George was 12 when the Civil War broke out, and he was soon the body servant of Colonel Charles Devens, a Harvard graduate and a lawyer from Massachusetts. A soldier's body servant was not just a valet. This was wartime. He pitched tents. He maintained gear. He loaded and unloaded wagons. He cooked and served meals. He cared for the wounded, and he dug graves for the dead. This is a 12-year-old. Colonel Devens was put in command of the 15th Regiment Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, that's a mouthful, in 1861, and the next month they passed through Baltimore on their way to Washington, D.C., where one of Devens' officers wrote in a letter home, "We have secured the services of a nice colored boy. He understands his business to the letter." The first battle, that's the slave schedule. The first battle soon came, and it was Ball's Bluff. Devens' regiment crossed the Potomac River from Maryland to capture a high bluff on the Virginia side, but the rebels had rifles and the Union soldiers. All they had were smoothbore muskets, not quite so accurate. Devens' troops retreated across the river, and they were slaughtered. Their bodies washed downstream in the swift currents. Before the war came to the Potomac River, a conch shell would be blown. Maryland and Virginia slaves would gather on those riverbanks, singing songs of faith and freedom across the river to each other, call and response, their voices rising to the heavens above those swift currents below. Devens himself was wounded 3 times during the war in Virginia, at Ball's Bluff, at Fair Oaks, and at Chancellorsville. In April 1865, he led the advance into Richmond, where he stood on the steps at the capital of the Confederacy, where his troops were the first to occupy the city, and he was appointed military governor. You can tell who he is in that picture. Devens, with George by his side, spent almost the entire war in Virginia. Had George been captured, he would have been sold down the river, or possibly even executed on the spot for serving the enemy. After the war, General Devens was Attorney General under President Rutherford B. Hayes. In 1881, the Army of the Potomac reunion banquet was held in Hartford. Devens gave a short speech. Clemens also spoke at the event. The details of George's war experiences are unknown, but his introduction to the life of a servant was a baptism of fire. Clemens later said that George came north after the war, where he worked for 8 or 10 years before coming to work for the Clemens family. In 1870, and this is the census, George was working as a waiter in Worcester, Massachusetts, at the Bay State House where Devens lived, a large hotel that was well known for its billiards room. He also was attending school. By 1871, he was in Hartford, where he married Rhoda Hayes. They were married by the Reverend Robert Dyson, pastor of the Pearl Street African Methodist Episcopal Church in Hartford, where George served as a deacon. In 1871 and 72, George worked at Allen House, the grandest hotel in Hartford, whose dining hall seated 400 people. It was popular with famous visitors that included Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. In 1873, George was in partnership in a restaurant, Packard in Griffin. The Clemenses moved into their new home in mid-September in 1874. Clemens gave a speech at the Allen House just 3 weeks later. Clemens later recalled famously that George came to wash some windows and remained half a generation. In October 1874, Twain visited Harriet Beecher Stowe without wearing a cravat, bow tie. Realizing this serious breach of etiquette, he sent a servant back over to Stowe's house with her cravat wrapped up in a piece of paper with the note, "Herewith receive a call from the rest of me." 50 years later, Katie Leary claimed that that servant was George. Clemens says George was handsome, well-built, shrewd, wise, polite, always good-natured, cheerful to gaiety, honest, religious, a cautious truth-teller, devoted friend to the family, champion of its interests, a sort of idol to the children, and a trial to Mrs. Clemens. He never cursed, he did not drink, did not smoke, did not swear, and he was thrifty. I'm talking about George, not Twain. George was also a gambler. He pumped the Clemens dinner guests for inside political information before placing bets. It worked. He kept $1,500 in greenbacks stashed in his mattress in his room, about 4 times his annual salary from the Clemenses. He also acted as a private banker for the black community in Hartford, where he was admired for providing a service that was denied them by most Hartford banks. George is best known for his role as a surrogate father for the Clemens daughters. Clemens said he was always ready for service as a horse, a camel, elephant, or any other kind of transportation required. The Clemens' Irish lady's maid, Katie Leary, confirms that the girls were crazy about him. George could put a flaming candle into his mouth and put it out. I've actually tried that because I thought I might do it here tonight. I decided not to. I didn't. Don't try. It left the Clemens girls in reverent admiration, or I should say reverent admiration. At the age of 11, Susie wrote her father that, "We are learning to play euchre now, and we like it very much. Today we played with Mama, Rosa, Katie, Clara, and George." George patiently suffered through piano lessons given him by an 8-year-old Clara. Then there was Abner the cat. George taught Abner how to answer 4 bells just like a servant. He took Abner into the kitchen and proved it. Had the sisters ring the bells. 2 bells, no Abner. 3 bells, no Abner. 5 bells, no Abner. 4 bells. Abner plunged through the doorway. Twain thought Abner looked a little hunched, as if he might have been pushed. Besides the plunging kitty, there were always lots of flies buzzing in the house, and especially a lot of them one summer. Olivia Clemens paid George a bounty on the flies that he killed. George presented plate after plate of dead flies until there were no more live flies in the house. George kept appearing with more plates of dead ones. Twain remarked, "We are now probably living beyond our income." Olivia soon discovered that her daughters were paying neighborhood children to catch flies, no doubt yielding them a tidy profit. Clemens thought the girls were innocent of any ulterior motives and had assumed their mother was eagerly gathering flies for some kind of mysterious scientific purpose. George could be a buzzkill in other ways. During overly long storytelling sessions with their father, Clara suspected her mother of sending George into the library with imaginary errands and messages to rescue Clemens from the clutches of his daughters. Clemens himself was never jealous of George as a competing father figure. When recalling the Hartford house years later, Twain said, "I fancy I could see them all again. I could call the children back and hear them romp with George, that peerless black ex-slave and children's idol." Besides being a surrogate parent and playmate to the Clemens girls, George did have other duties: answering the door, screening guests, graciously turning away uninvited guests when required. Clemens bragged that he had trained George to lie very well. This upset Olivia. George also moved rugs, ran errands, helped with the routine housekeeping such as sweeping and cleaning the marble. He supervised the setting of the table. He served the courses of each meal and removed plates after dinner. He safeguarded the family's silverware and glassware, and he was supposed to keep all the wine and beer on the premises under lock and key. Clemens would tell guest stories at dinner. George had the habit of laughing at those Mark Twain stories before Clemens finished telling them. Katie Leary, who liked George but could never overcome her own racism, complained that he would laugh right out loud before anybody could stop him, that colored laugh that was kind of loud. Clara Clemens saw it a bit differently. George was a great addition to the family and afforded Father almost as much amusement as Father did George. George did grocery shopping. He sorted the family mail. He ran errands. Once, when Twain sent George to a tailor to have the sleeves cut off an ill-fitting coat, he found out only after the sleeves had been cut off that the coat belonged to a dinner guest from the night before. George's personal life was messy. His flirtations with the black cooks were worrisome to Twain. Katie Leary said George claimed about women that they bother the very hell out of me. I just step out and I can't help myself. They begin making advances to me very bold. Clemens saw it a bit differently and complained about George's disposition to gallantry with the black cooks and made clear his wish that George would go back to live with his wife because when he was with her, it curtails her immoralities by limiting her time for them. George later found the man who was having an affair with his wife and beat the stuffing out of him. This news made the newspapers. Despite his unsuccessful marriage, George would succeed in life like all black Americans then and now. George, like Jim, knew how to negotiate his way in a white society that was by turns welcoming, indifferent, paternalistic, condescending, and hostile. But his years in Hartford were undoubtedly his happiest, even if his marriage did not survive. In 1891, when the Clemenses moved to Europe, George went to work at the Union League Club of New York. That's an image of a newspaper article about the club. That's a picture of the waiters there. The man over there on the far left might be George Griffin. There's an enlargement. It's very hard to tell from that. He became head waiter and continued his private banking, taking pay vouchers for collateral. But when he loaned money to wealthy white members of the club during the Panic of 1893, he accepted only gold watches and diamonds as collateral. George was nobody's fool. In 1893, Clemens visited New York City, and George called on him at his hotel, faultlessly dressed, as was his wont. Clemens conducted a prankish experiment. They walked together to the Century Company publishing offices. Mr. Griffin was consulted for his opinion on some artist proofs for Twain's next book, while the white people in the office just gawked. During that 1893 visit, Clemens learned that George had a 4-month-old daughter, his first child. He named her after Clara Clemens. He told Twain that being a father had changed him. He was saving money in a special bank account for his daughter's future education. He no longer charged interest on the loans he made to his fellow waiters who needed money for sick children. George said his daughter would have educational opportunities that he himself had been denied. After being a paternal presence in another man's children for 2 decades, George was at last the happy father of his own child. George also had a second wife, Mary Washington, who had worked as a servant for an acquaintance of Clemens in Hartford. By the time of George's death in May 1897, Mary had given birth to their son, Lucius, just 2 months before. On that May morning, as Mary called George to breakfast at 6 o'clock, he suffered a heart attack. Media magnate and multimillionaire Frank Munsey wrote to Twain after George's death, "He never lost an opportunity to praise you and your family. His loyalty to you was unbounded. He had accumulated considerable property, about $8,000. That would be about $300,000 today. He was such a superior man that I had become very fond of him. He was a thorough New Englander and stood for the solid principles of New England." There were 2 women who visited the Twain household, plus Twain's biographer, Albert Bigelow Payne, who said that George was a very good example of the Southern Negro. This means that George was very adept at wearing the mask of a butler, just as Jim in Huckleberry Finn was very adept at wearing a minstrel mask. Clara recalled her family's grief when they learned of his death. "We all felt that one of our very own family had gone from us." Despite George Griffin's carefully laid plans for the future, fate had not been kind. His 4-month-old daughter, Clara Clemens, had died just 3 weeks after George and Clemens had visited those Century offices. Mary and her son Lucius moved back to Hartford. It appears that Mary did not gain access to her husband's estate. Lucius, the son George never got to know, died at age 13 in Hartford in 1910, a month before Mark Twain died in Reading. Mary went to work in Hartford, but went off her rocker in the early 1920s, according to the son of her employer. She had lost her infant daughter, her husband, his fortune, and her teenage son. Of course, in the 1920s, white Americans might suffer clinical depression or profound bereavement. Black Americans, they just went off their rocker. Mary died at age 80 in November 1937. There are no direct living descendants known of George Griffin today. Only a handful of letters and documents by George survive. If it were not for the force of his personality that left indelible impressions on a handful of people who left their recorded memories of him, George would be nothing more than a comical glimmer in the technicolor epic of Mark Twain's biography. It is a genuine loss to American literature and history that George did not live long enough to record his own memoirs. He lived a full and extraordinary life, the stuff of which fictionalized biographies and movies are made. George is one of 3 black men who contributed to the character of Jim in Huckleberry Finn: Daniel Quarles, John T. Lewis, and George Griffin. Clemens admired all 3 of these men greatly, but for different reasons. Clemens was a little boy when he knew Daniel Quarles as Uncle Daniel, and he no doubt saw Uncle Daniel the way Huck at first saw Jim as a young boy, as a superstitious, minstrel figure, a sort of man-child. John T. Lewis, and this is Twain posing with John T. Lewis in later years, was a devout Dunkard Baptist in his spiritual beliefs, which closely parallel Quaker beliefs, which I've talked about here before. And those beliefs were Lewis's contribution to Jim's moral character in Huckleberry Finn. The general tenets of Quaker faith drove most of the themes and even the plot of Huckleberry Finn, and it's through Jim, with John T. Lewis as his spiritual model, that places those values front and center of our great American novel. It is clear from George's paternal role in the Clemens household that he is the model for Jim's pivotal position as the paternal presence in Huck's life. Just as Clemens overcame his childhood perceptions of Daniel Quarles and arrived at a mature view of that man, Huck overcame his boyish perceptions of Jim and sees his humanity eventually. But for that to happen, it wasn't enough for Jim to simply embody the spiritual qualities inspired by John T. Lewis. Those qualities had to be imparted to Huck, and that is where George Griffin's contribution to Jim's character comes into play. Jim is a father figure for Huck, and those are the very qualities that Huck recalls in his moments before he famously rips up his letter to Jim's owner, Miss Watson. Huck had decided to obey the law and turn Jim in as a runaway slave, but in that moment, Huck recognizes Jim's humanity and he disobeys the law and does what is right. George's contribution to the character of Jim establishes George as a profoundly influential historical figure in his own right. Harriet Tubman was from Maryland. Frederick Douglass was from Maryland. Hosea Henson, the model for Uncle Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin, was from Maryland. And George Griffin was from Maryland. Thank you, Maryland. In 1875, a local photographer took a series of stereo view photographs of the interior and exterior of the Clemens home. The dozen or so surviving images were thought to be all that existed at that time, but last year I purchased a previously unknown image of 4 servants relaxing on the Umbra. In this image, 3 women, all wearing aprons, and a tall, handsome black man are seated in chairs. The man is properly attired in the full evening dress appropriate for a butler in a private household, as opposed to the very different evening dress of a guest or a butler working in a club or a hotel. The women are probably coachman Patrick McClear's wife, Mary McClear, nursemaid Lizzie Wills, better known as Whapping Alice, and Clara's beer-swilling wet nurse, Maria McLaughlin. While the precise identification of these female servants is not yet certain, the identity of the black man is beyond all doubt. George Griffin was the only black man employed as a butler by the Clemens family in 1875 when the photograph was taken. I will just say George looks good, he knows he looks good, and if the gods of historical evidence forever grant us only this one image of George Griffin, let this be that image. What exactly was full evening dress? The consensus on full evening dress for a butler working in a private household in the U.S. in 1875 called for peak lapels, a white cravat, a white vest, and a white shirt, swallowtail coat. Some are pointed like that, some are a little more blunt. There is the lapel folded around the chair for George Griffin. You can see it around the arm of the chair, I think. There is a white cravat, ties like a bow tie, and you tuck in the long strands into your coat. Those are dress shoes that no servant would wear. They have one eyelet, they'd fall apart under the stress of being a servant. Those are the boots that a servant would wear. Those are the spats that a servant would wear. Those are the spats that George wore. He would wear no gloves. Each one of these features is visible in George's attire. If clothes make the man, George makes the clothes. If you were a dinner guest of the Clemenses in the 1870s or 80s, you were greeted at the door by a tall, handsome, literate black man in white tie, full evening dress, who would also be serving you dinner later on. This would have profoundly upset a drunken Pap Finn who ranted in Huckleberry Finn about another stylish black man, screeching, "A free Negro!" I'm substituting the word. "A mulatto had the whitest shirt on you ever see. And there ain't a man in that town that's got as fine clothes as what he had. He could vote. And to see the cool way of that Negro." Even Katie Leary, Olivia's lady's maid, could not contain her racism when it came to George's appearance. "George was really very nice for a colored boy, but he was very conceited in those days. Yes, George used to say he was the best shaped man in Hartford, the very best shaped. He said Ryan the tailor always asked for him when he wanted to try on clothes for a model. He was a nice looking Negro, but he was a Negro just the same." I disrespectfully beg to disagree with both of those bigots. In his only known portrait, George, dressed to the nines, is the best shaped embodiment of the cool ways of a professional butler who, even as a teenage body servant in the Civil War, understood his business to the letter. Putting a human face to the man who inspired the character of Jim is no small moment. Jim is the most important black character in American fiction, as I've pointed out. Seeing this photograph for the first time is much the same as finally meeting Jim himself face to face. George has been known to generations of Twainians for more than 100 years, and like the Clemenses, we've always been on a first-name basis with the George. Like them, we have an affection for George, a genuine affection, but calling him or any black adult working as a servant by their first name, whether intentionally or not, can be a form of infantilizing, a carryover from centuries of enslavement and servitude. Meeting George face to face, I find it now impossible not to see him as Mr. Griffin. Huck thought hard about writing that letter which would have thrust Jim back into slavery. In that off-sided moment in Huckleberry Finn, Huck recalls that, "I see Jim before me all the time." Huck sees Jim's humanity and tears up that letter. He knows from that moment moving forward that he would break the laws of the land, and so he thought, as he had been taught, the laws of God for helping a runaway slave, and he would suffer eternal damnation for the sake of his enslaved friend, father figure, and fellow human being. Huck is mistaken, of course, about going to hell for helping Jim. He has no idea how good a boy he has become, that he's come of age, has found his own inner light, that divine spirit that exists in every human being. This makes the famous oath that he swears to himself when he tears up that letter all the more breathtaking. Huck swears, "All right then, I'll go to hell." Every scholar has quoted that in Twain studies for decades. We have had a much longer time to think about Mr. Griffin than Huck had to think about Jim. But have we seen Mr. Griffin before us all this time? We have not. That's the stereo view. Meet George. Mr. Griffin. Are we seeing Mr. Griffin now? I think we are. I could hear that barely. Many say Huckleberry Finn is about slavery. Others say it's more broadly about race. In fact, it is about humanity. All of us, of every race, all ages, different sexes, ethnicities, heights, weights, abilities, disabilities, and sexual identities, all creeds and socioeconomic classes, every last one of us. We have all had a very long time to look into each other's faces. Are we seeing Mr. Griffin's humanity? Yes. Then surely we see our common humanity. I have one last question for you then. As we move forward, are we, like brave, sweet little Huckleberry, willing to go to hell for the sake of our common humanity? Yes, we are. Don't tell me, tell Mr. Griffin. Now, I just got a whole bunch of white people to do a little bit of call and response. And I've got an A.M.E. preacher here who sounds like he may be eager to get to hell as soon as possible. Mark Twain once said, "Heaven for climate, hell for society." And with that, I believe my work is done. Thank you.
Chairs are being moved. I can't tell you how happy I am that thanks to our good friend Kevin MacDonnell, we now have a photograph of George Griffin, an important figure not only in the Clemens household, but more broadly, a key member of the Hartford community of his time. I hate to say it, but many, many years ago when I first saw George's role presented in a Mark Twain House tour, the guide showed a silhouetted African American man holding a tray with a huge grin. It was horrible. It is hard to stamp out bigotry. That was many, many years ago. Since then, museum staff, historians, Twainian scholars, and now Kevin in deep detail have provided an image of Griffin as a three-dimensional man with hopes, fears, anger, humor, flaws, and affections. This panel is just to build on this idea, and I hope it will lead to more investigations and events to come. We'll hear from our panelists for a while, then you can join the conversation whether you're here or at home. Kevin MacDonnell, I've told you about. Good job.
Thank you.
That summarized the wonderful talk summarizing his meticulous scholarship, which you can read about at length, as I mentioned, in the Mark Twain Journal released today to coincide with this photo reveal and Kevin's work, and will be available for purchase when we close down here. Kevin will sign, as I mentioned, these issues. So to introduce our peeps, are they going to come up now? Sam and Camesha? Why not? Then it seems odd to introduce you when you're down there. The Reverend Samuel Corey Blanks, now ascending the stage after Dr. Scruggs. He is the pastor of Metropolitan A.M.E. Zion Church on Main Street in Hartford. The Met is the organizational and spiritual descendant of George Griffin's church, A.M.E. Zion on Pearl Street downtown. A North Carolinian, Reverend Blanks studied at Livingston College and Fayetteville State University. He accepted the call to ministry at the tender age of 15 and received his first appointment to pastor a North Carolina church when he was 17 years old. After other pastorates down south, he was transferred to New England in 2019, serving at Spotswood A.M.E. Zion Church in New Britain. And in February 23, he was assigned to this important pastorate here in Hartford. Dr. Camesha Scruggs is an assistant professor of history at Central Connecticut State University, a proud sixth-generation Texan, another Texan. She received her BA and MA in history from Texas Southern University and her doctorate at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Her research fields and teaching interests are 20th century U.S. history, African American history, and public history. She is intent on bringing the stories that arise from history and scholarship to broader audiences and ensuring that these stories reflect diverse narratives. Her doctoral dissertation looked at black maids in Texas in the 20th century and how their jobs were impacted by interventions from various organizations and institutions, and her current work carries this focus on domestic service into the New Deal era. And so we can begin, and I'll join the group. So, can you hear me? Yes. So, Reverend Blanks, I just wanted to start with you. Or shall I call you, may I say Sam?
Oh, absolutely. You can say
Okay.
Sam. That's fine.
Sam, you told me that you consider the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the famous A.M.E. churches, to be a freedom church, deeply embedded in the struggle to get all Americans the respect that human beings deserve.
Well, and first of all, let me say I'm old enough to say these things that I'm going to say. I know I look 12. But serving as a Methodist minister, in particular in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, that's what that means, A.M.E. Zion. And hearing the journey of George Griffin and his foundation there in Maryland makes sense as to why we, as a Methodist body, in particular the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, really rally around us saying that we're the Freedom Church. We're the Freedom Church because we're the church that is proud to say that it's the church of Harriet Tubman, it is the church of Frederick Douglass, and it is also the church of Sojourner Truth, and it is also the church of George Griffin. And so our ideals and our thoughts around bringing people, especially African Americans, because primarily in the South, being a part of a church really wasn't something that was welcomed. So individuals that was making their track, especially once they reached the North, they found a place of promise. And so the A.M.E. Zion Church really took off right here in the North. And so it would be appropriate for George Griffin, where he was born and raised and found his way here to Connecticut and planted in Hartford, that he could only find one place to plot and to continue his faith journey, and that would be in a place of freedom based on the historical track of those who he followed. And so that's where we are.
Where you are. Now, Dr. Scruggs, or may I call you Camesha? Thank you. Your work on issues of domestic service are impressive. I'd like to hear a little more about what led you to your dissertation subject, the story of the Texas maids that I mentioned.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks to the entire Mark Twain staff who have supported, as I call it, a scholarly shenanigan. It started with an internship gone awry, actually. As a graduate student at Texas Southern, I received the opportunity to work at the Abraham Lincoln Home in Springfield, Illinois. And in that particular project, I researched the existence of individuals that performed domestic service in the Abraham Lincoln Home in Springfield, Illinois. So, of course, How funny we talk about Lincoln. As with George. And in that, I realized that it was important to talk about the individuals that make the house a home, right? And in that, there is dignity in that service, in that work. And we definitely can see that in George's life, in the individuals that are performing the service in the Clemens home. So that also made me reflect upon the experiences of my grandmothers, my community elder women. And that's what prompted my, as I call it, an academic love letter to my community by researching the academic side of domestic service.
So back to Sam. Sorry, Kevin, but you can break in at any time. Resting your voice. Sam, I just wondered, when George Griffin went to church on a Sunday morning, what do you think he would have found there in the church as it existed on Pearl Street in those days? Or
You have to come to church on Sunday to really see.
I knew that would come out.
If George Griffin was a part of the Pearl Street Church, as it is now in its current content and context of what we are now, the Metropolitan A.M.E Zion Church, he would have walked into a building that was full of people connecting in one sound and in one concert, and that is in prayer as well as praise. The beauty of the black church in particular, I'm sure it was with George Griffin, because you got to remember, there was only one African American church in Hartford until the two churches split, which is now Faith Congregational and the Metropolitan Church, and we sit in front of each other right here in the city of Hartford. But for George to come to church on a Sunday morning, and I did the math because any good preacher, I wrote my sermon before I came, he would have walked 32 minutes from this site to get to church on Elm Street. And in a 32-minute hike, can you imagine what he was singing and saying to himself while still remembering that although he served as a butler, his greatest responsibility as a person was to be loyal to his faith as well as to the people that he would be sitting in the pew with on Sunday morning. And so when they would sing songs of praises, when they would be worshiping or and reading scripture or hearing the preacher, and you referred to it as the call and response, I'm sure if the black preacher was standing there saying, "Let the church say amen," George was saying amen, because that's the response that kept his faith strong.
I do have a question for you, if your voice is rested up. I just was wondering how George got out of slavery. Do we know anything about that? Because he sort of went from being enslaved to being a valet to a Union officer.
We don't know. We know that Twain said he saw a good part of the Civil War. We know that Charles Devens went through Maryland before he got to Washington, D.C., and I assume, but we can't prove, that he probably encountered George Griffin along that path, along that way. But we don't know this for a fact. When you're researching black Americans in the 19th century, especially before the Civil War, it is depressing. I can't tell you how much. You look at slave schedules, and I went through pages and pages of slave schedules. People, human beings, listed as property with no names, their ages, and their sex. And if you read page after page after page of that, it really brings you down. I've done a lot of research in Ancestry.com and Family Search and Genealogy Bank and all the newspaper databases. Unlike most Twain scholars, I cast a wider net, and I'm trying to find nuggets and bits of information that no one else knows about Twain, or to illuminate some unknown aspect of his life or some person connected with Twain. I've researched a lot of these people, and George Griffin, researching him was just a different experience for me entirely for that reason. On the plus side, the more I learned about the guy, the more I loved him. He's just a terrific person. He's smart, he's intelligent, he's on the ball, he's a self-starter. If you look, I always say, I'm a grandpa, so I'm always giving advice to my daughter and my granddaughter. And one of the things I tell them, it's not where you are in life, and it's not where you end up in life. It's how far have you come, and are you still on the voyage? And when it comes to George Griffin, I look at how far he came. Enslaved as a child, served a Union general in the Civil War that emancipated his people, by law anyway, then trained as a servant for 10 years, then worked in the Clemens household next door to Harriet Beecher Stowe, and became a model, as I've said several times, for the most important black figure in American literature. Maybe Uncle Tom before him, and I'm not talking about the Uncle Tom slang that we hear today. I'm talking about the original character of Uncle Tom, who's almost a Christ figure in the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Very different person than what you might think from the slang term we hear nowadays. And then you get to Jim and Huckleberry Finn, which I've already explained. And he's just, what a legacy. None of us have that legacy, do we? And then afterwards, he's rubbing shoulders with a multimillionaire media magnate who thinks he's a man from New England, a representative of New England and everything that New England stands for. And then there were women who met him who thought he was a perfect Southern Negro, kind of a step and fetch it, which means that Griffin could wear the mask. He could be who that person that he was confronting expected him to be. He knew how to survive. He knew how to get along in a society, as I said, that was not always friendly. And so at the end of my research, I just had unbounded admiration for him. And beforehand, I warned the Reverend that I would be preaching tonight. And I did. And I warned him about the call and response as well. But we don't know how they encountered. I will add, Devens was a federal marshal before the Civil War. His job was returning escaped slaves back to slavery. But he didn't do that. He bought them, and then he emancipated them, spent his own money, and that's what he did every time. One slave he was unsuccessful in freeing, but he found him after the Civil War and got him a job in Washington, D.C. That's who George Griffin went to work for. And so my guess, and it's only a guess, is that he may have purchased him from his owner and then emancipated him and kept him as a body servant and paid him as a body servant. Some body servants were even paid in the Confederate Army. So they certainly were paid in the Union Army. That was routine. But we just don't know. But we know he met the right guy at the right time.
Dr. Scruggs, Camesha, do you, in your work on domestic service, did you glean much about the situation of butlers in particular in the, of course, in the Gilded Age era? Of course, you're dealing with a slightly later era.
True, but I still have to have a foundation of what does domestic service look like prior to that, right? And so when we think about George, for example, we think about what skills did he obtain, right? As we've talked about, he has these skills that definitely come into use for him. But also, when we think about George, what is the transition from unpaid laborer to paid laborer? What was that like for George, right? What did that mean for people of color who have been doing this work that has, as some have seen, have been naturally, that they're naturally built to do? right? And so for me, I think that that's something that we should definitely think about. But we also, when it comes to Gilded Age households, when we think about George, that means a lot. Because with a Gilded Age household, which has Victorian influences, we have upstairs, we have downstairs, and to have someone that has been doing this work, right, and is now a physical representation of of this labor, right? Because of course, Gilded Age, you have servants. That means that that's status and class, and to have someone like George to represent that, to be the face of that at the Clemens household, I think that says a lot.
I would agree. And Reverend Blanks, I was lucky enough the other day to meet your kids, and it made me wonder. And I've also watched your services on your YouTube channel, and I know you have a big banner sort of celebrating the long history of the church. And I wonder, how is the history of the church kind of transmitted to the children of the congregation? How is that brought alive?
That's a great question. My wife, who was with me tonight, just wave your hand. She's over there. We, um, of course, we have a blended family, and we are serving a historic African Methodist, well, I just say African American church, very historic church. But my wife and I, she is born and bred New Englander. She was raised in New Hampshire, born in Maine. And how in the world did we meet? She came down south and took a job teaching there in the public school system in Charlotte, where we met. But she met me as a preacher, because I remember I started at 17. And so I'm a preacher in the South, and I am about to marry a white woman from New England and bring her into the black church experience. What an experience. Our first experience was I love seafood. So I decided that I'm going to take her to go get seafood. And to my surprise, here I'm thinking that they were having some worship service or something was happening. And my wife says, "No, Sam, that's a sign that they're having the Daughters and Son of Confederate meeting right there in the same place where we were eating." But to come to the north, and this is where I'm trying to tread to the heart of the South, would have never embraced a George Griffin working as a individual to get paid. He would have always been a slave to people. He would have never been recognized as free. And to come to the north, where our family, um, we're raising two beautiful babies, and our history reflects one thing. What I've noticed, even in the sacred space that I serve, is that people who may have been afraid for years to expose their relationships with individuals who may not look like them, but because they see a family that's serving, that's loving, I see more people embracing culture, embracing diversity, because you can't be afraid of a George Griffin and just keep a George Griffin locked up, tied up, tangled up, butlering, because eventually a George Griffin is going to be exposed for who a George Griffin has been. and is to a community of people as it was with the Clements.
Thank you. Yes, please.
To that, I can definitely see, right, the impact of George, right? When we think about the fact that, we have these revelations that George is considered a part of the family. We see that he is a deacon, he's a banker, right? There's a community status to George, right? And I can only imagine, right, with my historical imagination, what it meant for George, especially post emancipation and after the 15th Amendment and having the right to vote, the ability to advocate, right? Just, I mean, we see, right? We've seen images of African American men going to the polls for the first time dressed well, right? There's a dignity that's in that, right? And we've talked about his fashion. We talked about what that means. We've talked about, the Victorian dress, but also what did that mean that he was more than a person that was inside of a uniform? He was a person, right? And I think I want people to think about that when we think about George. It's not just the work that he did, but what were the impacts of someone like George, right? Even later, or even throughout African American historiography, we see the impact and the influence of domestic workers, right? We see that they're part of households. They get the nomenclature that they are like family, but they also are enactors of change, right? Even when we think about, the fact that George is part of, as we've talked about, part of the Clements, the Mark Twain, you know, literature historiography, right? So what does that tell us about the significance of someone that seems to be doing a work that's behind the scenes, that's invisible, that they are indeed visible?
I- Since we do public history here at the Mark Twain House, I'd love to hear a little more about your work at the Lincoln Home in Illinois, Camesha, and also the W.E.B. Du Bois home site, correct? Up in Great Barrington, right. And how you present these stories, because you talk about telling stories in a different way from perhaps the past.
So my work at the Abraham Lincoln Home involved research, once again going through all of these documents, these narratives, everything from biographies, newspaper stories, and even looking at census records, and how do we see the roles of these individuals working in these spaces, right? We can kind of see what was it like to work in a famous household, right? I could see individuals that worked in the Abraham Lincoln household and what it would be like to work in the Samuel Clemens household. I mean, just imagine, you seeing him in this desk. Thanks to Matt for doing a very great living history tour of giving humanity and agency to George. Thank you for that, and thank you to the staff for making sure that that's now a part of the experience here at the Mark Twain House Museum. With that, we like to tell the stories of individuals that may not be, as I say, name brand, right? We want to tell the stories of regular, everyday people. I tell my students, when we think about history, history really is everyday people doing not so everyday things. It just happens to have a date attached to it, right? And so whether it is telling the story of working class people, whether it's telling the story of women at historic sites, whether it's telling the stories of marginalized individuals, those stories deserve a greater audience, right? Because people can connect to individuals on a regular, everyday basis. It makes me think about sometimes the work that I did at the Du Bois Boyhood Home site out in Great Barrington. Although there is no physical site out there, it is interpretive waysides, and we walk the woods and discuss Du Bois. And in that, we talk about Du Bois and how he's a hometown kid and connecting him to these regular, everyday moments, right? We talk about things like Du Bois wrote a letter to his grandmother. What kid doesn't communicate with their grandparents, right? We also talk about things that could happen to anyone, including loss. We make individuals that may seem like name brand and people that we talk about, but we also like to make them normal, that they are normal and they have feelings. And those stories need to be recognized because people can connect to personal narratives and the personal stories. So that's what I like to do in my interpretation, whether it is through exhibits, whether it's through implementing the the touring, the guides, the narratives and the scripts. I like for those stories to be a part.
Appreciative audience, thank you. Reverend Blanks, this is sort of a funny question. In a sermon a few weeks back, you celebrated the fact that African American churches are loud in their praise. I grew up as a Quaker, which Kevin had mentioned in his talk, which is just about as quiet as you can get. And I know your wife Nicole started out as a Catholic, which is somewhere in between. I wonder what you might have to say about these variant ways of worship.
Well, you do listen to me then. I will say, when you think about faith, and especially in particular the way that people express themselves in what we call our worship experience, there are many ways of expression of worship. Some people don't say one word, but you can see that they're in a posture of worship because you can just identify or make a connection maybe just by the tears that's coming down their face, not because there's a problem, but because they're in reflection or in just reverence. Worship in an African American church takes on many different faces. Uh, some people might run, some people might shout, some people might just sing, some people might just holler. You might be sitting beside somebody, you don't get nervous if you ever come worship with us and somebody just start, ah! Because that's just an expression of, of thanksgiving. And whatever posture that you take in worship, uh, and even if you're not connected to a Protestant faith, but whatever tenet of religion that you are connected to, there is still a sense of reverence to a God or a belief in something, right? So for us, we, as it was with George, when he came to church, his connection was to God. His thanks was to God. His praise was to God. His worship was to God. And if he was connected to, and because he was connected to the Pearl Street Church, now the Metropolitan Church, I know what his tenets was in his faith because we recite every Sunday the Apostles' Creed. And that says that he believed in the one Lord, one faith, one baptism. He believed in the communion of saints. In other words, he believed in fellowship. He believed in the forgiveness of sins. In other words, he believed that even if you've done me wrong, I still forgive you. I still love you. And he believed that even if he died, that's not it, because he believed in the resurrection. That's what George believed. And that's what we believe. And that's why we are so loud.
And I'll add to that, apparently the music is particularly good on what, the second and the fourth Sunday, is that right?
You, you gotta, every Sunday is a great Sunday for music at Metropolitan. But if you're into pipe organs, you have to come on second and fourth Sundays because we have the pipe organ that's played on that Sunday, on those 2 Sundays in particular. But any Sunday you show up, there's gonna be good music, good music. And if you're into anthems, come on, we have them. We sing them every Sunday.
Now, I think we might be getting close to the Q&A from the audience, but I wanted to ask, just really briefly, what kind of insights and surprises each of you have learned from our celebration of Mr. Griffin here? And starting with you, Kevin, I mean, you've told us a lot about that, but is it possible for you to say it in one sentence?
Buy the Mark Twain Journal. It has a 20,000-word biography of George Griffin. Mm-hmm. I continue adding to it. It's 26,000 words now, but I've added mostly commentary and peripheral information. You're getting 95% of the data on Griffin in the journal. But I'll add 2 footnotes to things that Reverend Blanks and Dr. Scruggs have said. When Dr. Scruggs mentioned the 15th Amendment, I laughed. Because in that 1870 census that I briefly showed, you wouldn't have noticed it, but there was a column there for the age of the waiters that were working in Worcester, Massachusetts. I'm very careful to pronounce that correctly. And most of the waiters there, including George, said they were 22 years old. Curious. Weren't any 20 or 23 or 26? That census was in June of 1870, just a few months after the 15th Amendment was ratified, which extended the vote to black men, not black women, not white women, just white men, black men. So all the waiters at that particular establishment reported they were 22 years old. I think some of them were lying. I think Mr. Griffin was lying. In fact, I know he was. But it made me like him a lot more because he was determined to go out and vote. The other footnote I'll add is to what he said about faith. There was a black man. I read all the slave narratives in Maryland. And if you want to talk about surprises, read the slave narratives that are available online at the Library of Congress for the Federal Writers Project. I've read all of them for Maryland, Virginia, Texas, not Missouri. I've tried Mississippi, but there's just too many of them. But I've read a bunch of them. And there are recordings of them on YouTube. Can only take them in small doses. I'll warn you ahead of time. But there was one in Maryland that really struck me, and that was an older black slave, an enslaved man. I try not to use the word slave. I try to use the words enslaved person, and I do that consciously. So this older enslaved man prayed to God, not that he would get wealth or not that something good would happen to him or others or any material thing, not even for his freedom directly. What he prayed for was for God to change the heart of his master so that his master would see a way to emancipate him. Now, I don't know if God heard that prayer, but the master heard it. The master murdered him. On the master's deathbed, he confessed to the murder. Up until that time, all the other enslaved people on that farm didn't know what happened to the man. He just disappeared. They didn't know if he ran away or what had become of him. But the master got to worrying about going to hell. Now, y'all have agreed to go to hell if necessary, so just for the record. But the master was worried about that, and he confessed to it on his deathbed. And so when you read enough of those things, a lot of those things applied to George Griffin. Spending the first 12 years of your life as a slave had to leave you with some form of PTSD. Serving as a teenager as a body servant in the Civil War, digging graves and watching soldiers go out and get killed, nursing the wounded and all the rest of it, that had to be PTSD. And yet, when I look at the years of George Griffin in the Clemens household, I see not a trace of PTSD. I see a guy being a father figure to the Clemens sisters. That is a surprise to me. That is an enormous surprise to me. And it's a reflection on one more reason why I love George Griffin.
Well, thank you, Kevin. So, insight, surprises? that,
Well, not not as far as the work, right? Because George has been doing this work literally, I would say, probably his entire life. But to me, what has been surprising is to see George in the community, right? What did George look like outside of the Clemens household? Yes, he was affiliated with the Clemens household, and yes, he was a servant, but yet we still see dignity in George. We see humanity. We see all of these dimensions of George. That lets you know that George really is indeed a person and that his labor was important, right? We see that when we tour the house, when we see the grandeur of the house and George doing the work along with the others in the house that are doing the work, that are doing this domestic work. We definitely see, I think, as Matt has said, they are part of the scenery. It's a performance, right? All of that still um, gives us a glimpse into the work and how important it really is. So, really, no surprises, but the fact that, we know that George is human, right? And there's a humanity in it. So, I always like that part.
I love the fact that there's a photo, finally, at last, after probably no one has seen it since it was taken. Insights, surprises, Sam.
I think my only insight was um, he, from the religious standpoint, he served as a deacon. And if you are a deacon in the church, you're very close to the pastor, right? And so he had status not only in the community and in the home, but he also was a respected man in the church. And so, however and whatever the church decided to do next, George Griffin was at the table.
Okay, well, I think we can move on to the audience questions. The way it's on. Good. Thanks, Al. Um, the way this works is that when you ask a question here in the audience, I'm going to repeat it so that the people out in virtual land can hear it too. So I see a hand up toward the back over this way.
Dr. Scruggs, do you have a female in your studies of domestic?
Just to repeat the question, this is for Dr. Scruggs, and the question is that in her research on domestic service, is there a female, am I getting this right, sort of the equivalent of George in the role, a role
Right, that made that kind of impression on you?
that made that kind of an impression on Dr. Scruggs?
First of all, thank you for your question. There are several women that are of that have a similar status to George. For me, I think particularly of African American laundresses, right? That brings me back to Thavolia Glimp, who is a historian who talks about the household environment in Out of the House of Bondage. It also makes me think of Tara Hunter's To Joy My Freedom, in which she talks about African American washerwomen, right? When they talk about that type of work, right, this domestic work, this work that is considered interior, when it comes to washerwomen, there is an independence that comes with that because they do not live in the household. They do their work and they go home, right? And as we've discussed in the tours of George, of course, would occasionally be in the Clemens home if it was too late. But for me, it's they did the work and they went home. They had an independent life outside of their labor. So there are definitely several African American women that do this domestic work, right? But also the idea of being a part of family, having these maternal and paternal influences within these households, right? We hear recollections, we read recollections of individuals when they grow older that, there may have been a George that felt like a father figure, or there may have been a maid in the home that felt like a mother figure to them. So there are definitely several examples and anecdotes of women that had George-like qualities in my work.
The question is, well, first, a thank you to the panel, which I share. And second, Mark Twain was very close to the actor William Gillette, who made the role of Sherlock Holmes famous. And the question, and he had a valet who was Japanese American. And the question is whether either man, have I got this right, tended to brag about valet. Thumbs up, I've got it right.
I can't imagine that he didn't. And the reason being that Twain wrote a letter to his wife, Olivia, in 1893 after he and Griffin had been walking around in New York City. And he said he might be the most remarkable character he's ever met. Twain didn't say that very often about anybody. And he said that about George Griffin. And if he said it at that time, and if you read a family sketch, and I quote from it extensively, and it's separately published, but it's Twain's account of George Griffin, although my biography goes way out beyond the time of the Clemenses. He brags about him in that. So I can't imagine that Clemens, as well as he knew William Gillette was part of the Clemens household. He was there all the time. Olivia and Katie Leary thought he was pretty sexy and talked about him. No, I'm not kidding. Katie Leary tells the story. His nickname was the Ladder because he was so tall. And Katie said he was just the most handsome man she had ever seen. Don't you think so, Mrs. Clemens? And she said, yes. And so there you are. William Gillette, by the way, performed as Mark Twain in front of Mark Twain in the 1870s. And Twain was in the audience and came to him afterwards backstage and said, you've given me one more reason to regret that I was ever born. Kind of a left-handed compliment. I think it was a compliment. I take it as a compliment. And so did Griffin, who at a 1930 Hartford dinner bragged about that compliment from Twain. So yes, and there's a wonderful biography of William Gillette that's about 2 inches thick. I wish I could remember the author's name, but the short answer is he had to have bragged to him about it. He was in the household all the time. They knew each other very well. He funded William Gillette's early career to the tune of $2,000 or $3,000. Translate that into modern dollars. So he believed in Gillette and his talent and forgave him for imitating him on stage, which Hal Holbrook used, by the way, a recording of Gillette as his model. So it's almost certain, and this is one of those situations when you do this research that you can make these suppositions and draw these conclusions, but you don't have any direct evidence of it. So that's not the kind of thing I would include in the biography because I didn't have direct evidence, but it's the sort of thing I do believe.
More questions? Yes, right here. Yeah, the question is that the questioner has read The Help, and presumably seen the movie, and was just wondering if Dr. Scruggs would have anything to say about, about the role of the Help itself, the book, the movie, whatever.
So thank you for that question, right? When it comes to The Help, right, it's a story, it's a narrative about, as you said, a white woman that reflects on her experiences with a black domestic, right? We've seen that in several instances. And what I get from The Help, although I do have some concerns about the optics of it, but what I get from it also is the impact, right, of that domestic servant upon that writer, right? We can definitely see that in several ways, and I think that we can argue that George definitely had an impact on a writer, right? When we think about some of the later works that have been written, I think George may have been on Twain's mind when he's writing about works on lynchings, right? Those types of things. And so we can definitely see what is the impact of these people that seem to be invisible, right? We don't really see their work, but they really do have a visibility. So I think that the help can definitely introduce people to domestic service, but it can also prompt you, as with an organization that I'm a member of, the Association of Black Women Historians, that there are definitely more narratives that you can find and actually locate the lived experiences of domestic workers in white households.
Yes, down in front. Hi. Okay. No, well, the question is about George's sort of dual role as a servant in the household, catering to a white family, and then yet he is also out in the city as a much more powerful figure and having to earn money on his own, and uh, and the question is for Reverend Blanks.
Photos, you can tell this is a confident brother. And you referenced that the wife had made reference of him seemingly being conceited. But I don't see conceited, I see confident, right? To the children, this is like their father, right? As hard as that might be to swallow, but to the children, this is like daddy. Uh, in the community, George, I'm down. Can you help me get up? How much you need? All right, go in his pocket. $6,000 that he had under a pillow, equivalent to $300,000. The brother had it together. So even if he was in the home and never asked a question, trust me, he had an answer. Even if never asked, George, what you think we should do, even if it is not recorded, I'm pretty sure Mark Twain sat down with him over a smoke or a glass of wine and just unpacked with George, can you help me to figure out what to do next? So he wasn't, in my opinion, wasn't some domestic person who just sat still, went to his room when told. He didn't operate in some way of the bitterness of the grip of what it is to be in a home of a person over slavery. He operated in my thought as a free thinker, and at any point could have probably left and went and did his own thing. But what kept him probably here was that I'm George.
Yeah, there is a famous story about one of the instances that Kevin referred to when he laughed at Mark Twain's jokes behind the screen before he was supposed to. Uh, that he was fired that night by Livy Clemens, and the next day he showed up and he said, "You can't do this without me." So I think that reflects your point. Yes, Alana.
So your question is, how can we document the existence?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't have to repeat the question. I got too interested in what was going on. I'm sorry. Now, the question is historically, of course, the lives of black people, as Kevin referred to, have been very, poorly documented. And that is there any kind of a move afoot to improve this situation? Have I got that right, pretty much? Yeah, there's a lot of technology these days, but on the historical front, are there developments that you could foresee?
I wouldn't exactly say developments. For me, always trying to find the existence of African Americans, right? yes, we can see them, right? Sometimes they are listed in census documents. Sometimes they're listed on vessels. As I tell my students, sometimes you have to read against the grain and read between the lines, right? So an example that I use often is the enslaved, right? It's not as if enslaved individuals were writing, today this happened on the plantation. But when we can look at things like correspondence between a slave mistress and her family members, she may talk about an enslaved person. That right there denotes that they do exist in the record. And that's how we find these stories. That's how we find their existence, right? And yes, we do have narratives that were written by formerly enslaved people. We have several, the narrative of individuals like Henry Box Brown, who mailed himself to freedom, right, from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia. And yes, we have the narratives of individuals like Sojourner Truth, and we also have the WPA narratives. Sometimes you have to read against the grain. You have to read in between the lines, because I tell my students, if you've been talked about, that means that you have an existence. And so that's how we, as scholars, go into these records, which can be challenging, right? But there is still an existence that's validated within that.
Okay, I think we're getting near the end here, but I'm going to guess that maybe two more questions are in order. Yes, I saw one up here.
I haven't located his gravesite yet, and there is a find a grave element as part of Ancestry.com, and I've spent a lot of time trying to nail down all of these, what a lot of people would call peripheral details, but I thrive on that, and I'm trying to find, I mean, I've got his daughter's first and middle and last name. I know that his second wife was living with her unmarried sister, and that the daughter's middle name was her name. I know that on George's death certificate,
Kevin, I forgot again to repeat the question. I am obviously a washout as a moderator. But the question
I
is,
didn't nudge you.
the question which you might have inferred from the response was, where is there a grave that we know about? Where a grave site for George Griffin?
Yeah, I don't just spontaneously talk about graves unless someone asks me a question. Did not find a grave for him. I did find a grave for his second wife. Did not find a grave for his daughter or his son, but I think the son is probably buried in Hartford, somewhere in the vicinity of his second wife, but I couldn't find it. Once you get to the 1870 census, researching Black Americans becomes much easier because they start showing up in the census. Before that, good luck. So I guess my question, and it kind of relates to what was asked of you earlier, is there any systematic way of researching Black Americans, anything underfoot to make it easier? I have kind of a reputation of finding things about Mark Twain that were kind of hiding in plain sight. And the sources that I use, which I make known to everybody, are the genealogical databases and the online newspaper databases. And I spend a lot of time going through those looking for clues. There's all kinds of gems in there. And that's where you find Black Americans. It's where you find obituaries. It's where you find references to funerals and where they might be buried in a cemetery and so on. You find a lot of things there that you might not expect. I guess my attitude with George Griffin in particular was, he's a major figure in Mark Twain's life and has been for decades. He's been talked about in Mark Twain scholarship less than I think he deserves, but considerably. My first impression was, sorry, Reverend, but I'm going to say, why the hell hasn't somebody done his biography already? Why did it take a picture? Why didn't I do it earlier on? It took a picture to motivate me. All of a sudden, I looked at the guy and I just thought, I've got to know. But all this time, these newspaper databases and the genealogy databases, they've been around for 20 years. And I've been researching a lot of white people associated with Mark Twain, but George Griffin is the first Black American that I've researched. But you research them exactly the same way. There's less to be found. They tended, not to have their birth records recorded as often as white Americans, not because they were black, but because they were poor. That's true of New York, because I couldn't find birth records. And I was told by a clerk in New York City that 25% of all of the birth records of the late 19th century didn't get reported, and they're mostly black and poor people. And so it's frustrating. There needs to be a program to facilitate it and make it easier. There are a few websites and a few archives scattered here and there that assist with it, but they're just too few and they're too scattered.
Yeah, let me just add that for years, people here at the Mark Twain House have been looking into George Griffin's life in one way or another, and there's a file stuffed full of some findings, some visits to previous visits to Metropolitan A.M.E. Church in the 90s, and just a ton of stuff. But Kevin has sort of put this research on steroids. It's just the most complete kind of work, more details than anyone has ever known before, helping, along with his discovery of the photograph, to bring the guy alive. I did see one last question that was over that away somewhere. There you are. Okay, so this is Matt, who Camesha has been talking about, who plays George Griffin. We have George Griffin here. This is in our Living History tours, which is... So my question actually was, how to get more stories like George's across to really inspire other people. That's it. I mean, it's something you do, obviously. Not everyone's me, but I definitely think. But what can we do like after tomorrow or like after tonight? I know, we don't.
What do we see in the records, right? What do we see in the records? What's happening in the African American community at the time of George's tenure, we say, at the Clements home, right? What's showing up in the directories, what's showing up in the census records, what's showing up in newspapers, right? What's showing up, because at this time there are African American newspapers, right? They may not be based here in Hartford. They may be based in Boston. They may be based in New York, but they're definitely reflecting what's happening in this particular area, right? What's happening in Black New England, right? There are scholars that are definitely doing that work. Also, once again, I'm sure there are others that are like George. I mean, just a quick glance of, I want to say, I think I was looking at like an 1884 directory, right? And it shows that people, what their occupations are, right? Servants, maids, waiters, laundresses, right? Like we can start to do a data, right? A data sweep of who are those people, right? And can we find more information, right? That's why we can use Ancestry.com and all of these genealogical databases to tell those stories of people that were like George, right? Or people that were in the African American community in Hartford at the time. I know that there are scholars that have definitely done the work. As far as Connecticut, I know Connecticut Explored just recently celebrated their 10th anniversary, where they have a series of essays where they talk about African Americans in Connecticut, right? So you reach out to those types of individuals that have done the work, right? And I guess myself, since I'm somewhat in the work, and how can we do that? How can we make these people accessible, right? And just like the work that you do, right? If you come to the home, you'll see it. You'll see the perspective from George's eyes. And I think that that's definitely something that we can continue. And of course, museum educators, all of those public history type folks can do that for us as well. But also the public. We never know. We may find someone that, you know, whose family has been a part of the congregation that may have known George Griffin, right? We can still find ways to tell that story through those in the community and around him.
I'll add, and thank you, Dr. Schultz, Doctor, for saying that. And I'll just add in 2 seconds that exposure is key for a lot of people, just not only in the African American community, but just if we look at the landscape of Hartford, and just in the year that we've been here, there's so many people, students in particular, young adults, who would benefit from being exposed to uh, opportunities like this, to just sit down, even if they can't sit for 2 or 3 hours, but for 30 minutes or for 15 minutes, and just being poured into the different names of people. Because our African American world goes beyond Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We go beyond a Rosa Parks. It starts at the genesis of how we got here and the struggle and the journey and why we matter, to just not only as African Americans, but why we all matter as people, to help move the message forward. And so if we can just unearth some opportunities, I've been inspired just by reading about this guy. And I shined my shoes to come here tonight. So he's an inspiration. And everybody would benefit from this.
But no spats.
No spats. I won't know how to get them off tonight.
Well, I see someone who wants to add one more thing, but then we really have to. This is a question about, sorry. I would just, well, a quick question about, there's an African American museum in Branford, and there is the story there of a woman who walked from North Carolina to Colchester. This was an interesting lecture that the questioner heard. Do you know the name that she's thinking of?
Of my tongue, and there are
She
so
wants
many,
to know the
and
name
there are
of the
so many
person.
others, right? There is, I want to say there's an African American museum in Bridgeport. If we look at, right, and even just the recent discussion um, of enslaved individuals at Yale, right? That whole project, right? Where there's still these stories, there's still these narratives that are still being unearthed. Um, so there are definitely several ways to find out more about the African American presence here in Connecticut.
Okay, well, I want to thank Kevin MacDonnell and Dr. Camesha Scruggs and Reverend Samuel Blanks for a wonderful visit.